this in there. Is that better? Excellent. I'm kind of a wanderer, so I'm not going to stand up there. I'll try and keep away from that mic so it doesn't feed back. This is going to be, I'm going to try and keep this informal. If you have questions, just wave. Whoops, wrong way. There we go. Talk today is a basic introduction to plastics recycling. I'm going to try and cover as much as possible on that subject. I'm going to give you a basics on the plastics industry, lead into plastics recycling, focus on a couple of industries, bottle recycling and the automotive industry, talk about a few alternatives to recycling that might have impact on recyclers, and we'll go from there. This is, as I said, going to try and keep this pretty informal. If you have questions, raise your hand. I'm going to ask questions of you guys. Most of them are going to be raise your hands answers. If you got input, that's great too. A little bit about why I've been asked to give this presentation. My principal employee is the Michigan Molecular Institute. We're a research organization working with polymers. So I get onto the technical side, the academic side. I lecture at universities. I'm an adjunct with a few universities locally in the middle of Michigan. I'm also industrial. I'm CTO for a company. I've been research director for a couple of recycling companies too. So I've got a business sense, so everything I say isn't purely academic. I'm very active with the Society of Plastics Engineers. I've been the technical chair for GPEC for a couple of years, so that's the recycle side of the Plastics Society. So that's, you know, I play with plastics all the time, so that's why I was asked to give this presentation. So we've all seen these symbols. Anyone tell me what they mean? Okay. What does other mean? Other means anything that isn't one of those six. So it can be polycarbonate, which is a nice pure system. It can be PLA, which is a compostable system. It can be a blend of systems. They all fall under other. What do the circling arrows mean? You're one of the 80%. Most people give you that answer. Actually, the arrows have no meaning whatsoever. Okay. In fact, the attorneys of 11 states said that the arrows were misleading and took the plastics industry to task. There are only 6 plastics identified with those systems. So when you pick up your pop bottle, it'll have a number 1 on there because it's PET. Other than identifying what the materials are, and they're really called resin identification codes. They are not recycle codes, they're not recycle numbers. All it does is tell you what the plastic is. It has no bearing on whether the material can be recycled, whether it is recycled. There's just a limited number of applications where that system is used. And then going back to number 7, what does it really mean? Some people think that number 7, other, means bad. Children's milk bottles used to be made out of polycarbonate. Polycarbonate has as a component bisphenol A. Bisphenol A is not good to give to babies. So the mommy bloggers saw these number 7s and said, oh wow, anything with a number 7 must be bad to use for my child, must be bad systems. So it got a bad reputation. If you have a system of polypropylene, which is number 5, which has 12% of a filler, it is no longer a number 5, it's a number 7. So some people in the industry are seeing these resin identification codes as being a hindrance to innovation. I can't put the best system together because the best system has more than allowable to get me these codes. And these codes are what people see and understand. And other ones, you know, at number 7 can scare people off. I lose business. So depending on which source you go by, you can find a number of plots for these, but this is a nice one that the US government puts out. This talks to how much plastics is produced. We're producing about 31 million tons of plastics a year in North America. Recovery rate is under 10% though.
When did the identification code show up on that graph?
Pardon?
When did the identification code start showing up on plastics for that graph?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know when they started using those. I've been in the States 20 years and they've been using them all the time that I've been here. 80s maybe? Was it Clinton that brought that in? Was before him. I know when Gore was vice president, one of his pushes was plastics recycling. You saw a lot of new legislation directed toward that. You saw a lot of funding of recycle research when Gore was VP. So my guess is around that area it became popular. The one thing that I should point out, though, is that the requirements for all these things are done on a state-by-state basis. It's not federal legislation for most of the impacts. So when I talk about the 11% cutoff, that's because I think it's New Hampshire has that in their code, and because most of the suppliers in the country want to put 50-state products out, they go to the lowest common denominator. So why is that recycle number such an issue? 87% of the plastics produced are landfilled within 8 weeks. So that means from cradle to grave is 8 weeks for the vast majority of plastics produced. And the reason for that is most of the plastics come in used in packaging applications. Before I go much further, I'm going to take a step back. What are plastics? So I go to ASTM and I try and pull up these definitions. And their definition is it's a material. Okay, well that makes sense. It contains as an essential ingredient an organic substance. Okay, so that's your polymer chain. It's of large molecular weight. Okay, so it's a long chain. So if we look at polymers, polymers are made up of monomers. Monomers are base units. It's that kind of a single link in a chain. You start putting chains together, you get polymers. Polymers and plastics are often used synonymously. So it's solid in its finished state, and at some stage in its manufacture or in its processing into finished articles can be shaped by flow. So we have essentially two different types of ways that these materials can flow. One is defined as being a thermoplastic. So that means if I have my solid particle, I heat it up, it melts, I cool it down, it reforms. That's great. I can injection mold parts, I can do all kinds of stuff. That's the stuff that's easier to recycle, and which will be the main focus of the work that we'll go through today. Thermosets are slightly different. They still have long chains, but they'll have curing agents, or there'll be something within there that locks the long chains in position, so that when you heat those up again, they don't melt, they don't flow. So when you look at recycling those systems, there's a couple of ways you can do it, but they tend to be a little bit more finicky. So you can design what your cross-linking agent is and use another agent which will break that. That'll give you smaller polymer chains. Typically, say for example, a lot of foam used in automotive seats, that'll be a thermoset, a polyurethane thermoset. Those materials are ground up and then just used as filler into polyurethane. So it's a cheap product. A lot of that is maybe landfill avoidance rather than real recycling. Most of the rest of the talk I'll focus on thermoplastics, where I can heat it up, reuse it, and then go from there. I looked at the ASTM description of what a plastic was. I don't like that description. I think that really describes what a polymer is. Because a plastic product, I can't think of many out there that don't come with additives. And I've tried to put together a short list of some of the additives that you might see in your plastics. These could be anything from colorants to ultraviolet stabilizers, so I can leave my stuff out in the sun and it's not going to degrade in a week. Coupling agents, you know, if I got two different systems together. Antioxidants, all those kinds of things are very, very common in plastics. If I just take one of them, the filler system, and look at what the variations are there, you know, I can put another non-exclusive list of the types of fillers that you'll find that are common. Again, if I look at one of those systems, glass, we can get different shapes of glass, and these will give you different properties in your system. So I can have a polypropylene matrix filled with glass and just get different properties just by the shape of the glass. You know, if I have a long fiber glass as opposed to a short fiber glass, I'm going to get different properties in my polypropylene. If I come to recycle, it's a lot easier to recycle a sphere of glass in polypropylene than it is long chain. First thing I do with my materials is cut it up. So what am I going to do? I'm going to break all those long pieces of glass whilst I'm cutting it up. These are things that you kind of want to look at as you're looking into recycling. There are processes to recycle long glass fibers, but they're quite proprietary. Then if you look at the glass, what's on there? Is there a surface treatment? Did I put something on the glass to help it disperse in the polymer that I'm using? Maybe. Did I put something on the glass that once it's dispersed in the polymer, it will bind to the polymer? Maybe there's something there. So there's a lot of additives that are used in plastic, so it's not just a simple system. If we look at where plastics are used, there's a lot in building and construction, a lot in consumer products. US exports a lot, but still packaging is the big animal. Why do we use plastics? Low weight, high reliability, superior wear resistance, whole list of features that you see on there. But the main one, and one that I haven't listed on there, is cost. Plastics are pretty cheap compared to the alternatives. Plastics industry is very important to the US. I live up here in Michigan. If you look around the Great Lakes, whether I'm looking at employees per thousand or total employees, you see we have quite a hotbed of the plastics industry up there. Texas and California are also very important to the plastics industry. Texas, obviously, because a lot of the gas comes in through Houston, and the plastics industry has grown up around there. The Great Lakes, it's principally because of the automotive industry. The auto industry uses a lot of plastics. The Great Lakes is states supplying the auto industry. If the map extended into Canada, you'd see Ontario as well is just as high. So I tried to take the 7 classifications that the Resident Identification Code gives you and look at how much material is produced and how much is recycled. Now this data is a little old, it's from 2007, but it still shows the right trend. And if we look at things like high-density polyethylene, this is the material that will be used to make milk bottles. We're seeing maybe 10% of that system is recycled. PET, this is pop bottles. This is the success story. You know, still relatively low.
That's water bottles, PET?
PET is water bottles or pop bottles, yeah. If we look at PVC, it registers as a 0. Now, I know that there's PVC recyclers out there, but the numbers are so low it doesn't register on government classification.
What's an example of an HDP?
A milk bottle.
Oh, a milk
Yeah. And let's see here, linear low density polyethylene, that's a lot of the thin bags or stretch film used for wrapping. And the reason that's so low is the collection infrastructure doesn't exist. So if you have plastic bags that you're trying to recycle, up until recently there was nowhere to go. A number of supermarket chains and Walmart, for example, have recently put boxes at the front so you can take your plastic bag, but that's a recent development. So there's a number of ways to classify your recycling. And principally, the best way to look at it is, what's the application that my recycled plastic is going to go into? So this terminology looks at primary recycling. I'm going to be using the plastic that I've recycled into essentially the same product that I would use the virgin plastic for. So PET bottle recycling is a huge contributor to this kind of recycling. Secondary recycling says, okay, I'm going to use my recycle system, but I'm going to use it in an application that has slightly less stringent requirements. So if I'm going to be doing that, then probably the amount of money that I can claim for my recycled system is going to be a little lower than virgin. And there's a couple of other ones. You can look at recovering the chemicals from the plastics recycle, and there's a few systems out there, so you basically break your chain, or you can recover the energy. As we know, most of the plastics come from oil, and it's just another way of having portable fuel. However, you put a lot of money and effort and time into making these plastics. Why take it all the way down here, where really you're just, it's again, landfill avoidance rather than recycling. If we look at recycling by states, you'll see that on the East Coast and West Coast, we do a pretty good job of recycling in the US. My state, Michigan, not so high. But anybody that knows the economics of Michigan will understand that, you know, we led the country into recession. We had a single state recession before anybody else, and we're slow to come out. One of the things, people don't want to give up waste collection, but recycled material collection, that's one of the ones that municipalities cut down pretty quickly. So that's why we're pretty low. If we look in the middle of the country, there's a lot of states here that are relatively low. What do these states have in common? Absolutely. Bottle bill, we'll get into that. I don't think any of those are bottle bill states. But principally, it's the logistics question. You know, there's very few people in very large states, and it costs a lot to move those around. And you've got lots of wide open area, so landfills are cheap. Talk today is going to be about why to recycle plastics. This slide just talks to why not recycle plastics. What's different between plastics and other materials? If I have a metal and I recycle it, I principally get the same properties of the metal as I had originally. Same with glass. That's not true with plastics. Plastics will degrade on recycling. I'll see a property diminished by change scission, heat histories. So if I heat my system up, I'm actually cutting the polymer chain. So if I cut the polymer chain, I'm going to change the properties. I'm not going to get the same properties. Action of additives. So I can add an additive that makes the plastic part that I'm using really, really good. But when it comes to recycling, it actually degrades the properties. The recycling process that I put the system through will degrade the properties. One of the biggest issues, though, is mixed plastics. Plastics of different families don't really like each other. There's a few exceptions. You know, Polyethylene and polypropylene kind of get along together. But if you have polycarbonate and polypropylene, you'll have a very weak system. So you really have to look at separating your plastics. And then the economics. Virgin plastics are still relatively cheap. When you look at the alternatives, it's still a relatively cheap thing to make. Recovering my plastic may be expensive, may be more expensive than just using the virgin system, in which case recycling is not going to be valid for that particular plastic. Now, if I painted a cheap plastic and now I have to remove the paint to be able to reuse that plastic, yeah, there's a lot of cost there. So how do we handle the plastic waste system? I put this slide up. Let's see, I first did this slide maybe 10, 15 years ago. And the first line reads, ban the use of plastics. And that was a position put out by Greenpeace maybe 2 decades ago. And everybody laughed at that. It's like, how ridiculous. Well, now we're seeing municipalities ban the use of single-use plastic bags, banning the use of styrofoam cups. We've seen McDonald's get rid of their styrofoam clamshells because they didn't like the image that was associated with them. We may not be banning all plastics, but we're working one by one in eliminating certain plastics from use. Okay, so we're not going to ban them. What are we going to do? Can we bury them in landfills? Reaction to that around the world is very different. The US, we have a lot of cheap land, so we use landfills. Japan doesn't. Japan has a huge density population, very localized, so they don't like landfills. They like burning the fuel. Burning the waste for fuel. Different concepts. We in America tend not to like having incinerators in our backyard. It's okay in my neighbor's yard, but I don't want that incinerator pumping all that stuff into my atmosphere, right? Canada to Michigan. This was quite a political issue. We had a governor that one of the things that she ran on was she was going to stop the importing of trash from Toronto into Michigan to use our landfills. She got elected, it kind of stopped for a little while, and then it's back to its old state. I think that's politics, right? What else can we do? We can pyrolyze them to chemicals or fuels, as I've said a few times, and that seems to be a pretty good option. You know, if you've got a low population density and you don't have enough materials to make it viable to put a recycling plant and recover these systems, maybe recovering the fuel value is better than throwing it in the ground. But as today's talk is on recycling, I'm going to focus on the last bit, which is let's recycle them into useful properties, into useful products. If we go back to the first statement and ban the use of plastics, what are we going to use as alternatives? One of the old questions is, what are you going to use, plastic or paper? So this slide was taken from Interplast that uses a biodegradable plastic. So when they say here biodegradable, yes, they mean their plastic is. Most plastics are not biodegradable. But the rest of the table stands pretty true. And the two important things to look at here is cost, how much more it costs to make and transport your paper bags as it does your plastic. And then the other thing is petroleum use. So even though you think that the paper bag may be more, maybe a better sustainable product to use, you're actually using more fuel in its transportation and manufacture than you are with plastic. So if I look at my carbon footprint of a paper bag compared to a plastic bag, I'm winning with the plastic bag, which may be counterintuitive to most people. To get the numbers equal, I'd have to use a paper bag 3 times just to get to the same carbon footprint. That's not cost, that's carbon footprint. If I use a non-woven polypropylene bag, anybody use those reusable bags when they go to the grocers? Oh, a couple of people. Use cotton or polypropylene? Is it a plastic bag or a plastic bag? You ever wash them? You do? You're the first person who's ever said yes to that. And the reason I ask is some recent reports have come out with the ban that's gone into San Francisco. They're seeing an increase in the number of E. coli reports and foodborne illnesses associated with the ban on plastic bags that they've used. So if you are using reusable plastic bags, wash them, dispose of them after a while, you know.
There's also an increase in shoplifting.
Because you're taking your big bag in, yeah, makes sense. See the same increase in shoplifting in winter when we've all got our big coats on as opposed to shorts, right? So where is plastic waste generated? It's either generated by the guys producing the plastic part or by us as consumers. We look at the first one, post-industrial. So this could be the resin manufacturer, the fabricator, the compounder or reprocessor, packager, assembler, distributor, list goes on and on and on. As a recycler, though, we like these systems because what we have here is uniformity. We have a lot of the same sample. I don't have to worry about my separation. I know what it is. Chances are I've got a good relationship with the guys that I'm getting my plastic from, so they'll even tell me what's in there if there's something special. When I recycle it, I'm getting a narrow spec product. That means I can tell the person that I'm going to sell my pellets to what your properties are going to be pretty narrow. When I look at post-consumer, you know, it can come from any of these systems, but it's a whole mix. You know, it's numerous suppliers, numerous additive packages, numerous processing, numerous processes to make the polypropylene or polyethylene or whatever the system is. So even though it has the same number at the bottom, they may not be identical. So when I'm selling this system that I've recycled, I'm having to have a wider spec. As we all know, wider spec systems demand less money than narrow spec systems do. So in an ideal world, I want to see this. But if I'm looking at consumer waste, this is really what I'm dealing with. What plastic am I trying to recycle? I'll get into this a little bit later on when we talk about pop bottles. But essentially what I'm asking there, is it a single system? Is it a single plastic? Or are there multiple plastics in this system? If there's multiple plastics, I'm probably going to have to separate them. Can I separate them economically? They may differ from producer to producer. They may differ by production method. For example, ABS is used in computer housing. It's also used in, anyone still got an old telephone in the house? We haven't all switched to just cell phones, right? So your old telephone, that's a shiny ABS, that's an emulsion ABS. Your computer housing is typically a mass ABS, it's more of a matte finish. The mass ABS can be recycled 6 times without a great deal of loss in properties. The emulsion ABS, you see a drop-off in properties after maybe 2 or 3. So even though they're both called ABS, they don't have labels because they're not food containers, but if they did, they'd all be number 7s. They react to recycling very, very differently. Mass ABS it's a matte finish ABS, so it can be used in the automotive industry, be used in computer housing. Monomer source, oil or plant. We've seen the Coca-Cola advertisements, right, with up to 30% sustainable sourced plastic. Is that any different to 100% PET from oil-based? actually Coke's done a really good job of, in that case, making it equivalent. When it goes through the recycling plants, it recycles pretty similar. But if I have a PET bottle and I have a PLA bottle, and they're both clear and they both look identical to me, can I recycle those together? Not at all. So, and then, you know, as I've said a few times, fillers, paints, if I've got a plastic part that's painted, and I just regrind that up, those paint chips are going to make a weak part when I go to injection mold. So I need to either remove my paint or look for an application that can withstand that. So floor tile, plastic for floor tiles doesn't demand a lot of profit, but if I can remove my paint and then I've got a product I can use in essentially the same as virgin applications, I've significantly increased my profit there. So this is just an introductory slide, and we'll get into each of these topics a little bit more bit by bit. Politics in the US. Recycling is legislated on a state-by-state basis. So that means we have no overriding US legislation for recycling. What in reality that means is California seems to lead the way in the US. The California EPA will put out certain requirements, certain legislation, and typically within about 6 years, the rest of the country is following it. So if you want to know what's going to affect you in 6 years, look at what California is enacting right now. Look at the number of California municipalities that are enacting single plastic bag bans, usage bans. And ask yourself, how long is that going to be before it affects you? In Europe, Germany seems to be leading the way. In fact, they have a Green Party that runs for government. I think Germany had the Green Dot program, which is the producer of a part has to put in process and put in development and a route for that part to be recycled and recovered. So if you're selling a car into the German marketplace, you better make sure that there's plenty of ways that your plastics are going to be recovered and recycled. Other political entities, you look at some of the special interest groups. The American Chemical Society is sponsored by and supports the plastics industry. Greenpeace tends to be a little bit more on the other side. They tend to give bad grades to people who are using plastics when they can use something else. I have a Macintosh computer. I remember reading last year how California couldn't buy the new MacBooks because they're made from a metal that's now sealable. So even though they went from plastics to metal and got an increase in the grade when they made their products sealable and you couldn't replace batteries and stuff, it went down. I think that's all politics though, because within about 2 or 3 days, Greenpeace changed their stance on that, and so now California can buy those computers again. And then there's an entity that I just love the name of, the Campaign Against the Plastic Plague. I think that's pretty unambiguous about where their stance is on the use of plastics. And then the last comment I put on there is buying a used car recycling. I was in a meeting with some people from the Vehicle Recycling Partnership, which is the US Big Three joined together in pre-competitive way, in a pre-competitive form to look at ways to recycle auto parts. And the lady from Chrysler came in and she was shaking her hands in joy because they'd just been approved by the US government that they can say that selling and buying used cars is actually recycling. Do you consider when you buy a used car, is that recycling to you? It's reuse, right. If we look at public relations, I've talked about Coke a few times, and part of the reason is they really are leaders. They were down here yesterday with their dancing bear. They have their special logo that they're trying to put around. There's a Coke bottle in there, but really that's the number one, you know, that's the PET system. What you usually see, though, is next to it something that'll say, please recycle, or recycle and win, or something like that. So they're not saying that those arrows are mean that you can recycle, but the inference is there. One can infer from their implications that there's some recycling. So they're not going out and making recycle claims, but the comments are there. So Coke was the first to use recycled bottles. They stopped doing that, I believe, in 2003. In 2008, they opened a joint venture, a recycle plant in South Carolina, which has subsequently closed and been sold. They're sponsoring recycle collection bins around the country since 2008, and you'll see those all over the place. But now they're looking to go into, instead of just recycle, which they are still doing and still actively want to make sure that people understand that their PET can be recycled, but they're also looking at sustainable sources. So they're looking at getting into the green world, but they're taking, you know, a step to the side from recycle and looking at sustainable. Public relations. Anyone got an inkjet printer at home? You love buying the replacement inks in the little cartridges? Now, we used to throw those away. HP developed a process where if you have an HP printer, you can take their cartridges back and recycle them at the stores. So if you go to Staples, there's the HP bin, and they'll take their materials back. Let's see, Mercedes in '97, they were the first to put out a claim of having a total recyclable car. Really not sure what that means, but it's a good advertising claim. But who here would buy their then $40,000, now $100,000 car just because it was recycled? I don't think so. I mean, we want convertibles that go fast, or it fits everything that we need in. How low down is recyclable? If everything else is even, it may be a decider. When was the last time you heard Mercedes make that claim? It was probably in '97. Okay, costs associated with recycling. The big ones here are warehousing, consolidation. Your physical plant has to have some space. Transportation is huge. Transportation is really where a lot of recycling processes can either make it or lose it. Sorting, separating, washing, drying. A lot of that is done by hourly workers. It's relatively low-cost applications. Here gets a little bit more cost, but usually you can get a material through a process like this for about 15 to 40 cents a pound. So if we look at which materials you'd want to recycle, and again, this slide is a little old. It was taken in '98, so polypropylene has probably moved around here. Polypropylene prices have done this recently and kind of seem to be going a little higher.
So when you recycle the computer cases and computer housing, so it belongs to PS or it belongs to engineering plastics?
It's ABS, so it would be engineering plastics. But there's an issue with recycling old computer cases. So it's not just ABS, and it comes to the additive package that's there. It's flame retardant ABS. So they used to use brominated additives, and brominated additives are being legislated against in the US. So yes, you can recycle it, but can you reuse it? You know, there's that question. If it moves overseas, you know, different legislation, different restrictions to use. So it might be something that you could recycle and take offshore. So I talked about, how the price to recycle is somewhere in the 15 to 40 cents, depending on what your process is and how easy it is to collect it and how localized it is and all these factors. And typically, price for virgin is here and price for recycle is down here, maybe around 60% the price of virgin. It's one of the benefits of using recycle. It's typically a cheaper system. So as your virgin price goes down, your recycle price will go down too, but it'll kind of lag a little bit. So these systems, whereas it's typically normally a 25 cents difference in this example here, it can get as low as 15 cents. And if my process costs 25 cents, I'm going to lose 10 cents a pound when the market's like this.
How does the supply you have of these recycled polymers play into the pricing in the market versus virgin, as well as touching on your case where many of the fillers and halogens have been banned, once they're already in the plastic, provided you can find a use for them, will those already having the fillers embedded trade at a premium to, let's say, the same type of polymer without the filler?
Well, some additives have a certain lifespan, so that when you make your new product, you need to put more of that material in. UV stabilizers, for example. If I have a certain UV stabilizer in a certain system, when I go to recycle it, it will change the color of that plastic. I'm thinking here specifically of TPO bumpers. They have a specific UV stabilizer in there. The process used to remove the paint from these will change the color of that additive. Not a problem if I've got a red bumper or if I'm making a black bumper. It's a huge problem if I make a white bumper. Okay, because my white bumper will now appear to have a slight yellow tint to it. And when you buy a car, you want the whole thing to look the same color. So that's an issue. Supply and demand is obviously an issue.
I mean, I've heard stories where, if, let's say, a particular person you're selling the material to wants let's say a high-impact polystyrene with, melt X, density X, and whatever it may be. And they'll tell you, look, the virgin is $1 a pound. You give me 100 pounds a pound, I'll give you 50 cents a pound. You give me 200,000 pounds, I'll give you 60 cents a pound. Is that something that's kind of a one-off, or is that a general rule of thumb in the industry when trading recycled material?
Usually it's the other way around. As your volumes go up, your prices go down.
So this is just one-off things I'm reading about?
Probably, yeah. So as I said, as I was saying here, if your recycle process costs 25 cents and you're here at 15 cents, you're really losing money. At that point, if it's a short period of time, if it's a month, you can probably survive it. You're going to make a little bit more money here, you can survive that short time. If it goes on for a year, what happens? We look at the PET industry in the US 6-8 years ago, all these small mom and pop PET recyclers disappeared. And they disappeared because of the fluctuating price of PET. They can survive here, they can survive here. They couldn't survive extended periods of time here. Are we going to see the same with polypropylene? Polypropylene right now, the price fluctuates, I think from 77 up to 145, depending on grade, depending on time. If I'm recycling and I'm getting my material and I'm paying 145 recycle prices, and then I have to sell it at 77, it's not a good way of staying in business. It's nice if you can catch the wave the other way though, right? Technology, does the technology really exist? Is it out there? Is it something feasible? Is it something that I can license, or it's not patented and I can just go ahead and use it? Or do I have to develop it? I'm not going to go through all of these different terms here. I put them, you've got the sheet. If you're interested, I can talk to you one-on-one about each of them are, or you can look them up on Wikipedia. Wikipedia actually does a good job of describing a lot of these. But it's just a case of, does the actual recycle technology that you need to use for your system exist? So I've given a little overview of the recycle industry. And when I say recycle, I mean plastics recycle. I know we have recyclers from many fields, but I'm just referring to plastics. So now I'm going to focus on a couple of industry sectors. And the first one I'll look at is bottle recycling and then automotive. So we have two different PET bottles here. One is the Diet Coke that I like to drink, which is single system, it's PET. That's all it is. We look at ketchup. What it used to be was up to 6 layers, all next to each other, of alternating PET and EVOH. And they use that because of the barrier properties that it introduces. And for ketchup, it was seen that that was needed. So if I'm looking to recycle, this is relatively easy to recycle. Chop it, grind it, clean it, use it. This one, am I going to peel the layers apart? No. Am I going to chop it? Okay. Then I've got a mixture of EVOH and PET. What does that give me in properties? Is that any good? Those of you that put pop bottles in your curbside containers, will they even take ketchup bottles? Most won't. Just gets trashed. So Heinz they're looking at polypropylene. That's grayed out because they kind of were talking about it and went away from it. Then they're looking at the same plant-based PET that Coke developed. They're part of that partnership. I haven't been able to find whether they're using multi-layer EVOH there, though. I think they are.
For those that are new to recycling plastics, you may also want to note that the cap is different than the bottle.
Yep. I'll talk about that in a little bit as well.
So is there a resin ID number on the bottom of that?
Of which? I don't believe that there is, because it doesn't fit into the specification of what needs to have one. And if they don't need to have one, they don't want to make you think that, oh, this is a bad thing to have. So the first graph here is bottle production. You can see slightly more than half is PET. This is US. Slightly less than half is polyethylene, but pretty much those are the two. Everything else is just an also-ran. When we look at recycling, you know, pretty close to the same numbers. We look at the recycling rates in the US for each of the systems. PET is around, polyethylene is around the 25%. PET is a little lower, around 21, 22. It's been pretty consistent over the last decade. That's for the whole of the US. Actually, that's slightly wrong. That should just read PET from all sources, not just pop bottles. That should be HDP from all sources, not just milk bottles. If we look at pop bottle recycling, we get slightly better numbers. For all of the US, we're around the 35–40% mark. It's been declining a little bit recently. If we look at separate states, though, you've got New York there's about 75%. California is around 75%. They took a dip around 2000. And the reason for the dip was twofold. The recyclers in state, I talked about some of the mom and pop recyclers going out of business. A lot of those were in California. So the ability to recycle went down. But also that the way that they paid for the recycle changed. They went from a per unit to a per weight. So the recycle rate went down. And then right at the top, nearly at 100%, is my state, Michigan. Any idea why? 5 cents? 10 cents? Yeah, it's a bottle bill state. So where we saw, around 50% was the country's average. If you're a 5 cent a bottle state, you got up to 75%, and if you made it 10 cents, you got up to close to 100%. 10 cents a bottle, but it's a big difference. I came here and bought a bottle, and I looked for somewhere to take it back, and it pains me just to throw it or put it in a box or do something.
Don't you pay that 10 cents when you buy it?
Right. I mean, I pay it and get it back, but it's enough of an incentive for me to take a 12-pack at $1.20 and take it back. It's the level that gets 100% of the people to use the system.
Don't they have issues with that right now, though? Because other states bringing bottles in and collecting money for it and not paying that deposit.
Did you ever see that show? Yeah, I mean, that's what they talked about, was taking the pop bottles from New York into there. Don't have to go that far. We can go down to Ohio that doesn't do anything. Yeah. But in reality, the amount that coming in and the amount going out is about the same. We still have a surplus in the fund that's used to pay for the fund. So now there are issues, and the issues usually are with the grocer. The person who's actually doing the collecting. He has to have machines. He has to have employees. He has to have floor space that he gives away to the state to run this program. So those are the people that are complaining about it. But on a recycle basis, it's great, 100% participation. In a state that, if you remember, my state did pretty lowly overall, but we do this. So how to recycle PET? There's a step-by-step there, but essentially it's get it in and do a rough sorting, do a rough cleaning, do a better cleaning, do your fine separation and fine cleaning. Pelletize, sell. System can be as complex as guys at the line, or as easy as no guys anywhere and the computer does everything. The comment about the cap being different. Yes, it is. Caps are typically polypropylene. They have an ethyl vinyl acetate inside, so if you turn your cap upside down, there's a squishy bit that keeps a tight seal. If that degrades, it gives off acetic acid, which will degrade your polymer. We don't do this anymore, but we used to have PVC labels. PVC is really bad when you're trying to recycle something else. And the reason is it will degrade at the temperature that you're trying to process your other system. PVC degrades, it gives off HCl, another acid. The adhesives, depending on what adhesive, there may be some acids that come off from there as well. This is changing. We're changing the types of labels that we use. We're changing the materials that we use to make the labels from. We're changing the glues. So this is getting better. But if you look at the effect, this is viscosity. So viscosity is the study of flow. So this is how the plastic flows. So this is your viscosity of PET virgin. If I recycle, it goes down a little bit. But if I have PVC in there, it goes down a lot. So this is a good indication of what your molecular weight is, how long those chains are. So what I'm seeing here by the presence of a little bit of PVC is I've really shortened those chains up. I don't have any good properties. When my viscosity is this low, I can't make a bottle form out of it. I need some strength for the plastic to be able to make a bottle. I can't use this again for bottles. The other thing is PET has been described as polymeric popcorn. It's just waiting to break up again. It'll do it with water. So if I use a steam bath and there's water present, oops, sorry about that. Yeah, one more. There we go. And there's water present, and then I injection mold it, I'm going to cause the chain to break. And again, we can see what happens. We have vastly reduced molecular weight. Vastly reduced molecular weight means I can't use it to make that preform that I need to then blow up to make a bottle. Polyethylene has its own bunch of problems as well. It's not just PET that has problems, but principally it's contamination issues or odor issues. So what do we do with the plastics from bottles? We can make new bottles with it. That's great, right? PET has FDA approval for recycling, going back into food contact applications. So that's good. We'll get probably the maximum value for our materials there. Also, change it into fibers. I can make clothing, you can make carpets. If you look at them on a per system, PET, most of the recycle goes into fiber. Polyethylene, most of the recycle goes into non-food contact bottles. Some goes into food contact, but it's not even showing up on there. So bottle recycling. Most bottles that are recycled are either PET or high-density polyethylene. Well, that makes sense because most bottles that are made are either PET or high-density polyethylene. Technology exists. Infrastructure exists. Subsidized in some states. You can get better levels, better participation. One thing that was noted very recently is the people who drink water out of bottles, they've seen a 20% jump in 1 year in water bottle recycling. I'm not sure exactly why that's happening, but it's an observation. Anyone any idea why that might happen? Or maybe someone might know that market. So I'm going to switch steps right now, go on to automotive recycling. Automotive recycling is a mature industry, but it's not because of the plastics, it's because of the metals. Secondary to the metals is the glass. People want the metal, people want the glass. They don't want the plastic that's there. That's often seen as a nuisance. There are recycle mandates that are coming out, though, particularly in Europe, so that if you've got an automotive part, it either has to have recycle in it, or another mandate is if you made a part, you have to take back the plastic that's in there. So we are looking at ways to recycle plastics. One of the ways is to cherry pick. Let's look for low-hanging fruit and go for the best applications, the easiest systems that we can to recycle. Another way is to shred the whole system and then look at separating or use the mixture. This is just a brief description of the variety of some of the plastics that are used in applications. And these are just the more common uses in a particular application. You'll see a lot more variation. You'll see up to 180 different types of plastics used in a car. So I mentioned, first of all, cherry picking. Let's look for the parts that are easy to get to. These are car bumpers, all separated out and pulled off. They're easily identifiable. They're about 10 pounds each, so you've got about 10 pounds of plastic on the front of the car and 10 pounds at the back. They pop off. Recently, they've been designed to pop off easier, so disassembly is easier. Another one is the instrument panel. That's the thing right behind the steering wheel and before the glass. Now, that's an easy thing to pull out. Again, that's probably a 20-pound part, so you've got 20 pounds of maybe 2 or 3 different plastics that you then have to separate, but easy to get hold of. If you look at the materials that car bumpers were made from. You know, 60s, 70s, they were all made from steel. In the 80s, they switched to polyurethane. 90s into xenoi, and then more recently into TPO. And the reason is cost goes down with changing these. Another benefit is weight has also gone down as well. So you're seeing more fuel-efficient cars because you've got less weight that you're having to move around. So now I'm looking at a whole bunch of cars with TPO bumpers out there. A car has an average of 10 years before it gets scrapped. So most of the bumpers I'm seeing now are TPO. But is it really TPO? No. As I mentioned numerous times, these systems are painted. So I'd have to remove the paint to be able to get to the TPO to recycle it. May have fillers, may be glass, may be long glass. We've talked about that. If it's post-consumer, it could have anything there, you know. You were in a fender bender and you were looking for a cheaper way than going to the dealership to replace that bumper on the front, so you bought it off some guy on eBay for a third of the price. Well, it's not TPO, it's polypropylene. No, it doesn't have the same, it might look the same, but it doesn't have the same material. Recycler has to be aware of those kinds of things. You know, instead of replacing it, you decided to fill it with Bondo and then paint over it. Bumper stickers. This lady's gone a little bit extreme with her bumper stickers. It's gone all around the car. But, you know, the stickers, the adhesive, the glues, the paper, you know, it all affects your recycling process. I was working with a car plastics recycler, and we were getting our bumpers shipped up from Texas. We opened them up one morning, and there was a nice dead long snake in there. Luckily, it was a dead long snake, because in Michigan, it's kind of cold for them. It didn't survive the journey, but, you know, interesting. Okay, so bumpers are great, because that's essentially one plastic. What if I look at a car part that's a mixture of a few plastics? Maybe that's the way to go. So here we have a minivan door part. This was studied by the Chrysler group of the Vehicle Recycling Partnership in 2002. And this is the composition of plastics that are in there. A lot of ABS, a lot of polypropylene. So I can try and separate those bit by bit, or I can try shredding them all and then separate them then. So if I do that, I'm going to do a density separation. So I'm going to look at how the system floats in water and different solvents at different densities. So if I go below 1, you know, I'm using just basic water. I get some polypropylene and some polyethylene, a little bit of unknown. And the reason polypropylene appears in both of these regions is because you'll get some filled polypropylene. So if it's glass filled, it will have a higher density than just polypropylene on its own. So that's why it's appearing in 2 systems. So here I've got a density of about 1 to 1.2. So I've added a little bit of salt or something else to my water to bump up the density. And I get out all my ABS and polypropylene. And then above 1.2, you know, I've added more salt to get my density there. I'm getting all the rest of the stuff, including, luckily, all the bad stuff. The PVC, the polyurethane, which is a thermoset, so that's not going to melt. PVC will melt and just degrade when I'm trying to get other stuff. So I'm going to landfill 1% of my material. So I still have mixers here. So if I have polypropylene and polyethylene, you know, I can probably sell it as a wide spec polyolefin. You know, some people might buy that. I can compatibilize it. I can add an additive so it makes the system a little bit better. So I get a slightly narrower spec. I'm adding an additive though, so I'm adding cost. So I've got to weigh those two off. Here, if I add a little bit of an additive, I'm getting closer to ABS spec. So I might be able to get into a wide spec ABS specification property. And so ABS is more valuable than polypropylene, so that probably makes sense there. You know? So I've gone from landfilling the whole thing to landfilling less than 1%, just by doing a simple density separation. I was asked earlier about automotive shredder residue. This is where you shred the whole car, pull out the metal because the metal is of value and it's easy to get hold of. You just use magnets. And then the rest of it is called ASR. And that's all your oils, all your fluids, all the thermoplastics, all the thermosets, all in a big mush. And it looks like this. If you're lucky, it's that clean. But what do you do with it? Well, there's been some projects where the government has funded and they've looked at ways to separate it. Yes, they've separated it, but it's still relatively contaminated, so it didn't prove out to be viable. You can use it in asphalt and cement. You know, the elastic properties of the plastics that are there add some benefit to the asphalt and cement. The problem is the asphalt producers don't want to use it. They want to sell asphalt. They don't want something else there. You know, they're on a lose-lose situation there. One is it takes their material out of the system. If it improves properties, then they've got the ability to sell more asphalt later on has been removed. If it decreases properties, they get blamed. They're in a no-win situation. And I did this one because it kind of ties up the two industries. Chrysler put together a pop bottle beetle where they were taking PET and making the frame for one of their concept cars. Never saw production, but it's just a nice little story. So I talked about bottle recycling and automotive. Electronics is big. Packaging, I think, will become bigger as we're finding ways to collect the packaging after we've used it, other than municipalities collecting the systems. White goods, these are your refrigerators and your microwaves and that kind of stuff. Recycling in large cities makes sense, but for most of us, and even in relatively small municipalities, there's just not enough of this system to make a good business case to separate these out separately. Construction is an interesting one. To me, there seems to be a lot of opportunity there to recycle systems as you're pulling out and upgrading. But people build houses and they build them to last. They don't want to be pulling out plastic parts. So, you know, you might refurbish your kitchen and look at what you've got in there, but there's not a lot coming out. However, it does strike me as being a good place where you can be using a lot of the plastics that we're making. So if you've got a sewage line, it's usually PVC. So if you have a source for PVC, maybe that's somewhere that you can use it. Of course, you don't want the soft PVC, you want the hard PVC, otherwise you have other issues. So if you look at some alternative green options, alternative to recycling, some touch on recycling. So designing for recycling, that's something that some of the companies are spending more time at looking at. The automotive companies, Ford in particular, is doing a good job there. Part reuse, we'll look at that. Sustainability, material reduction, and then we'll touch on biodegradable polymers as well. But that's a whole different course, so we'll just touch on that briefly. So if I design for recycling, there's two parts of designing. One is design for assemble and disassemble, and then the other is what materials go into there. So if I look at a standard door here, we looked at what the system was before. It's got an ABS panel and a polyurethane foam armrest, rigid handle. You don't see the handle. Is that the handle right there? And then PVC coverings, so it has that kind of leather-like feel. Well, I can replace most of those with polypropylene. So now I've got a polypropylene panel, polypropylene armrest. Now, there'll be different polypropylenes. They'll have different additives. But essentially, they're all a compatible mixture. And I've used the word compatible quite a bit, but what it really means is I can put these two plastics together and not get weak junk out at the end. It may not be a narrow, perfect system, but it's at least something that I can use. So we look at the different plastics and what's compatible and what's not. If I take, example, polyethylene is compatible with itself. Low-density polyethylene, polypropylene, maybe with the other, depending on what the other is. But there's a lot of X's in there. There's a lot of things that you want to avoid. PVC X's across the board apart from with itself. Polystyrene, again, X's with everything except for itself. Now, if the other is ABS, then the polystyrene may be compatible with the ABS. So let's look at part reuse. We talked about this, automotive. Buying a used car, is that recycling? Probably not. But if I go to a scrap dealer and I pull something out of what really is a scrap yard, what really has gone essentially to waste, and I reuse that, you know, that's closer to recycling, right? Tire retreads, you know, instead of throwing away the whole tire, we cut the edge off and retread them and reuse those. Yeah, maybe. Other appliances, washing machines, dryers, buying those used. Used computers. Who here wants to use a 5-year-old computer? No. No, they've got a very limited lifespan. Packaging. We talked about the reusable bags. This is my favorite reusable bag. As you unzip that, out comes the bag, but it looks like a grenade. So material reuse, this is pre-thought into design. This is looking at ways to set yourself up so that the materials that you get back, you're then using further on down the line. So we'll take a high-density polyethylene milk jug. Has to be FDA compliant, has to have very specific viscosity. I'm making a large 1-gallon jug here. It's got to have certain properties. So I'm using a relatively expensive polyethylene. What happens if I can collect all those and make a shower gel jug that has less stringent requirements? Doesn't need to be clear, for example. I can put a whitening agent in there. Doesn't need to support quite as much weight on a handle, so I can have slightly less physical properties there. Okay, so then now I've used that. How long does that live? You know, maybe a week in the store and maybe a week in your refrigerator. This one, I have a 12-year-old boy, so this probably lasts about a month. You know, for a regular person, it might last 3 months. Toy may last 6 months, 2 years, something like that, if we take the step down. Then go to plastic lumber, 15 years. So we've taken something, reused it a number of times in the application, increased the length of the time that you're going to be using that material for, but we've got gradually lower and lower property requirements, so we can use the same system. There's a few of these arrangements that are out there, but they're very few. Material reduction, okay? Instead of figuring out how to avoid putting plastics into landfills, let's look at not using as much plastics to begin with. Arrow redesigned their water bottle, made it look to all of us like we're getting more because it's slightly taller. They used a thinner plastic wall. They narrowed it here so we have a hand grip, so we like the hand grip as well. They changed the cap, and the weight of the cap went down by about 50%. They changed the material that was used in the cap. They changed the thickness of the seal on the inside of the cap. So all in all, they did about a 30% reduction in weight. Good way going ahead, right? So biodegradable polymers. And I think I've got 1 or maybe 2 at the most slides on this. This really is a whole other subject. But biodegradable means it will degrade in the bio. So usually that means it's compostable. Other terms that you might use, you might hear renewable, sustainable, biosource, bioplastic. That really talks to where the monomer that's used to make the polymer comes from. It doesn't really talk at all to how biodegradable the system is. So I'm using something that's biodegradable and I'm going to make it. Do we all remember the sun chip bags that came out maybe 2 years ago, made from PLA? And everybody complained because they were really noisy and you couldn't hear the football as you were chewing on your chips. Okay, so they made a bag out of PLA. Well, PLA, if I throw it away, it's not going to degrade. I have to put it into a composting system. Okay? I don't have a composting system. I'm not even allowed by my city to start one. Okay, so I can't start it. City I live in doesn't have one. So I can't compost in the city. Won't biodegrade in a landfill, it needs oxygen. So is this really better than recycling? No. Largest compost facility I've ever visited was in Alberta, in Edmonton. And it's this huge, huge stainless steel building. I believe it's the largest stainless steel building in the world. About the size of 3 football fields. US football fields, not Canadian. But huge, huge infrastructure. And they compost day in, day out. Huge machinery, huge machinery. I asked, do you accept plastics here? Nope. Is that going to change? Nope. So even where they've got the facilities, they won't take the systems in. So this is a problem with a solution, but unwillingness to apply the solution. Some recent hot topics that you may have read about. So hot topics to me are, there's government funding, there's a lot of patents, there's a lot of research, I've seen a lot of papers, a lot of news articles. Doesn't mean necessarily it's what people are doing for money or what people have stopped doing for money. So look at the first one, the huge plastic waste island off the Pacific. That's been a story off the California coast for maybe a decade. I was in the Midwest, so I only heard about it about 2 years ago, after most of the crying had gone. The recent stories in that area are that it's not as big of a problem as we first thought it was. Oxo-biodegradable additives. That's quite a mouthful, but what these are additives that you can add to traditional plastics that will make them degrade. The people who make biodegradable additives don't like them because it's competition for them. They say it's not playing by the same set of rules. You're not measuring by the same standard. It's getting dark in here. So there's conflict with that use. E-scrap. E-scrap was huge. I'm talking again plastics here. 2003, 2006. Not so much now. So have all the problems been solved? Were the solutions something that can't be used? Mentioned earlier, a lot of the computer housings have brominated additives that we can't use in more modern applications. E-waste responsibility and take-back laws. This is still increasing in storage. You still see that. Rising costs of plastics, that's always an issue, right? Nobody's happy with what they have to pay for stuff. Energy recovery was huge 2004 to 2008 and a half. 2008 and a half, the economy of the whole world took a bit of a dump, and oil prices just plummeted. When the oil prices plummeted, no one was interested in taking plastic back to fuel. Now the prices are going up again, there's more interest. See more work there. PET recyclers can't solve the supply quandary. There's not enough PET for the recyclers in the US. So what's the state of the industry right now? As I mentioned, in 2008, the whole economy took a dump. The worldwide recycled plastic trade plummets. We saw purchases out of China that had been there for for years, had just disappeared overnight. There was nowhere for the plastics to go. Prices just plummeted. By March 2001, optimism. By more recently, demand is getting to where it's outstripping supply. So some conclusions from today's talks. Some plastics can be recycled, some can be recycled economically, some even environmentally. Some plastics can be recycled very profitably, but not all. And then the quote at the bottom is illustrated by this sign, which is at a local recycler. This is the types of plastics he will take. These are the types of plastics he will not do anything with. We're lucky, he will take these. A lot won't. A lot will only take 1 and 2. So, extra credit. Where I get a lot of my information from is Plastics News. Plastics Today. Plastics News does a free daily bulletin if you sign up for it. I have no affiliation to them, I'm just a happy customer. They'll give you data. You can look up prices on their indexes. Again, no affiliation, just a happy customer. These are a good couple of general resources to look up if you have plastics questions. And then probably the best book that I've seen on the topic of plastics recycling was by John Shears. It's a little old now, but the technologies that he talks about and the general trends are still appropriate. That's all I have. Any questions? Yes.
I understand it's more widely recycled in Europe right now than in the United States. It hasn't really been adapted yet. I understand part of it might be from the legislation.
Yes.
PVC content in it.
It could be legislation that way. It could also be the part of the buyback laws that Europe's under. So there has to be an outlet for that system. So the auto companies may be paying somebody to take this away. There may be a tipping fee associated. Okay, so it's energy recovery then.
Sorry?
Is it energy recovery?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
Is PVC an issue with doing it?
No, in fact, if you've got something that's heavily contaminated, that's probably the best place for it. Put it in a burner. If it's sealed, there's no oxygen going in, and just recover the energy. We're seeing more and more of that on the north-east coast. More and more incinerator plants going in, fuel recovery plants, but we're not there yet. Mm-hmm. The problem is a lot of them cross over with densities, so it's not a simple process to do. So yes, you can look up density tables and say, okay, this has what this has, but I mean, as you saw with the example I gave, polypropylene fell into the two systems, just whether it was filled or not. Right. There's other ways to do it. I mean, if you use like a Raman spectrometer attached to an air jet, you can detect quickly what the pellet is and shoot it either way. That's probably a better way of going. It's more expensive than water, yes. Yeah. Okay, well, thanks everyone. Thanks again.